The door to the Whitmore house swung open so hard it cracked against the wall, and Eliza barely had time to step back before his shadow filled the frame-wide shoulders. Black coat, the kind of man who walked into rooms like he already owned them, which in most of Black Hollow he did. "Time's up," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quiet in his voice was worse than shouting. Behind her, 7-year-old Molly pressed herself against the kitchen wall, arms wrapped tight around her own chest, eyes fixed on the man in the doorway, the way you fix your eyes on a rattlesnake when you can't run. Eliza squared her jaw. "I have until the end of the month." The agreement changed. He stepped inside without being invited. His boot heels were loud on the floorboards. He looked around the room at the cracked window, patched with oilcloth, the iron stove with rust along the base, the embroidered curtains. Eliza's mother had sewn 30 years ago, and his expression didn't change. No contempt, no satisfaction. Just a man taking inventory of what was already his. "Sign it today," he said, setting the papers on the table, "or I'll have my men help you pack." Molly made a small sound. Not a cry. Something smaller than that, a single caught breath, like a child trying very hard not to make noise and almost succeeding. Gideon's eyes moved to her. He looked at that little girl for 3 full seconds without saying a word. Then he turned back to Eliza and smiled. If you've never seen the frontier strip something good out of a person and replace it with nothing, you might not recognize what that smile was. But Eliza recognized it. She'd seen it before the night her husband didn't come home. Picked up the pen. "If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This is only the beginning." Ethan Walker had not slept well in 3 days. It was nothing unusual, and his left boot had a hole in the sole, which was also nothing unusual, and the horse he was riding a brown roan named Consequence. Because Ethan had a habit of naming things after lessons learned too late, kept favoring her left foreleg on rocky ground. 3 problems, none of them fatal. He'd had worse. He'd come down from the high pasture above Silver Creek 2 days before the first hard frost of the season, which put him about a week ahead of the cold if he moved steady and didn't stop for conversation. He wasn't planning to stop for conversation. He was planning to ride into Black Hollow, find the man who'd advertised a milk cow for sale in the Billings Gazette, pay a fair price, and turn right back around before the ground froze solid. Simple, contained. The kind of errand a man could complete without anything going sideways. Consequence snorted when they crested the last rise, and Black Hollow came into view below a loose scatter of buildings along a single main road, a livery at the north end, a general store, a saloon with a sun-bleached sign, and beyond it all, the wide brown roll of the Montana plains, stretching out until they flattened into sky. Ethan had been through towns like this before. Most of them smelled the same horse sweat and sawdust, and the particular kind of quiet that settled over a place where people had stopped expecting things to get better. He clicked his tongue at Consequence, and they started down the slope. He smelled the smoke before he saw the fire. It wasn't a building fire, the plume was too thin, too controlled, but it was coming from somewhere behind the general store, and it was the wrong color for a cook fire. Too dark. He filed that away and kept riding. The main road was nearly empty for mid-morning. A boy sat on the steps of the hardware store, cleaning a bridle, moving slowly the way boys move when adults have told them to stay put and look normal. 2 women stood near the well at the road's center, speaking low, and stopped talking entirely when Ethan's shadow passed over them. He touched the brim of his hat. They didn't respond. He was almost to the livery when he heard it. Not the words at first, just the tone, a man's voice, flat and sure, the kind that didn't bother to rise because it didn't need to. And under it, quieter, a woman's voice, doing the thing women did when they were past arguing and hadn't quite reached begging, holding the middle ground by pure will, Ethan pulled Consequence to a stop, told himself he was just orienting, just getting his bearings. The voices were coming from the side of the feed store, around the corner. Could have kept riding. The livery was 30 yards ahead, and the cow he'd come for was probably already waiting in a stall somewhere, and none of whatever was happening around that corner was his concern. He sat there for about 4 seconds. Then he turned Consequence's head and rode around the corner. There were 4 of them, 4 of Voss's men, though Ethan didn't know that yet. What he knew was that 3 of them were standing in a loose semicircle, and one of them had his hand wrapped around a woman's wrist, and the woman was not struggling because she had run out of struggling. And the little girl standing 6 feet away had gone completely rigid in the way children go rigid when they are trying not to exist. The man holding the woman's wrist was large and had a face that had been hit enough times it had stopped being surprised by anything. He was holding some kind of papers in his other hand, and he was saying, in that flat, measured voice, "Your mark." Right there. Just your mark and we're done. The woman, dark hair, slim, dressed for a working day, not a confrontation, had her eyes fixed on the papers. Her jaw was clenched so tight Ethan could see the muscle in it from 10 feet away. She said she needed more time, the little girl said. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. The man didn't look at her. "This doesn't concern children. She's my mother. Then you should teach her better manners than to keep Mr. Voss waiting." Ethan dismounted. He did it slowly, unhurried, looping Consequence reins over a post with the practiced motion of a man who was just stopping to stretch his legs. He walked toward the group at the same pace. The 3 men in the semicircle tracked him with their eyes. The one holding the woman's wrist didn't look up. "Trouble?" Ethan said. "Move on," one of the 3 said. He was younger than the others, lean, with a rifle slung across his back that he hadn't reached for. Yet, just asking, Ethan said. He stopped about 8 feet from the man with the papers. "Ma'am, you all right?" The woman looked at him. Her eyes were the color of creek water in October, gray-brown deep, currently assessing him, the way you assess a man you've never seen before when you're not sure if he's going to help or make it worse. He'd been looked at like that before. He didn't take it personally. "This is private business," the man with the papers said. He still hadn't looked at Ethan. "Seems like it's getting a little public," Ethan said. Now the man looked at him. He had small eyes, pale, set close together. He took in Ethan's worn coat, his battered hat, Consequence over at the post, a good horse but not a flashy one. He made his calculation in about 2 seconds and came to the wrong conclusion. "Walk away," he said. "Last time, I'll say it friendly." Ethan scratched the back of his neck. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking through something, and he was thinking through several things right now. The way the woman's wrist looked in that grip, the way the little girl was standing, and the fact that he had come to Black Hollow for a cow and was apparently not going to get that done before noon. "Here's the thing," Ethan said. "She doesn't look like she wants to sign." The woman's breath caught, just slightly. The man with the papers turned fully toward Ethan now, dropping the woman's wrist. She didn't run. She pulled her arm against her chest and stood her ground, and Ethan noted that too. "You got a name?" the man said. "Ethan Walker." "Walker." He said it like he was testing how it tasted. "You're not from here." "No." "Then you don't know how things work here." "I gotta guess," Ethan said. "Man named Voss. Owns a lot of things. People find it easier to go along." Something shifted in the man's face, not anger exactly, more like recalibration. He was updating his assessment of Ethan, and the new number was higher than the old one. "You know Mr. Voss. Never met him. Then you should think hard before you make yourself his concern." The 3 men in the semicircle had shifted. Small movements, almost unconscious weight redistributed, shoulders squared, the kind of physical grammar that preceded something. Ethan had been in enough situations to read it. He had about 30 seconds before this stopped being a conversation. He looked at the woman. "These documents," he said, "you signed them of your own will?" She met his eyes. There was something working behind hers calculation, hope, fear, the particular kind of anger that comes from being cornered for a long time. No, she said, quietly, clearly, like she was glad to say it out loud to someone. Ethan nodded. He looked back at the man with the papers. Then there's your answer, he said. The first man threw the punch without warning, which was the professional thing to do. Ethan had anticipated it by about half a second, which was enough to move his head so it caught his cheekbone instead of his nose. Still rattled his teeth. He grabbed the man's throwing arm on the way past and used the momentum to put him into the wall of the feed store, face first, hard enough that the impact made a sound like a door slamming shut. The next two came at the same time, which was less professional, because two men coming at the same time tend to get in each other's way, and these two did exactly that. Ethan stepped inside the first one's reach, took a punch to the ribs that knocked the wind sideways out of him, and got an elbow across the second one's jaw that sent him stumbling. The first one grabbed him from behind arms around his chest, lifting, and Ethan snapped his head back and felt the crunch of contact, and the grip loosened enough that he could get free and turn. The man with the papers had his hand on his gun. Everything slowed down in the way. It slowed down in these moments. Not time, exactly, but awareness, like the world offering you one clear frame before it moved again. The little girl said, "Please don't." She said it to the man with the gun. She said it with the absolute calm of a child who had learned very early that the world was dangerous, and the only tool she had against it was her own voice. The man hesitated. It was a real hesitation, not a long one, but real. Some part of him, the part that hadn't yet gone fully hard, registered a 7-year-old girl standing in front of him, asking him, "Please don't." Ethan used the hesitation. He was across the space in 2 steps, one hand on the man's gun hand, pushing it toward the ground, and they struggled for 3 ugly seconds before Ethan got the gun loose and took 3 steps back, putting himself between the men and the woman and the child. He was breathing hard. His ribs hurt. The cheekbone was starting to swell. He held the man's gun loosely at his side, pointed at the ground. "I'll be returning this," he said to the sheriff. "The sheriff works for Mr. Voss," the man said. He was breathing hard too, and his eyes had gone a color that was past calculation and into something colder. "Good to know," Ethan said. He looked at the woman. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, not gratitude, not yet, because gratitude came after. You were sure it was over, and this wasn't over, but something like it, layered over a deep and bone-tired wariness. "Eliza Whitmore," she said, like she was deciding he'd earned her name. "It's my daughter Molly." "Ethan Walker," he said. "I came here to buy a cow." Molly, 7 years old, standing in the dust of Black Hollow, with her arms still wrapped tight around herself, looked at him with eyes that had seen more than a child's eyes should have, and said, "That's a weird reason to be here." "I'm finding that out," Ethan said. The men were regrouping behind him. He could hear them, the particular sounds of bruised men deciding whether to try again or wait. He kept his eyes on Eliza. "You got somewhere to go right now?" he asked. "Somewhere that isn't here." She glanced past him at the men. Then she looked at her daughter. Then back at Ethan, and whatever she was calculating when she looked at him, she seemed to reach an answer. "The ranch," she said. 6 miles east. "Then we should go there," he said. "Now. Before Mr. Voss hears about this," she said, finishing his sentence in a tone that suggested she already knew exactly what was going to happen next. Had known it probably since the moment Gideon Voss walked through her door that morning and she'd picked up that pen. Signed it. Ethan had seen the papers, had seen the ink still drying on whatever she'd written there. He hadn't asked yet. There would be time for questions when they were moving. The man with the recently reclaimed face, the one Ethan had put into the wall, was standing up slowly. One hand pressed to his nose, and he was watching Ethan with an expression that was entirely patient. Professional patience, the kind that said, "This isn't over. It's just paused." "Mr. Voss will find you," he said. Not a threat, a statement of fact, delivered the way you'd tell someone the sun was going to rise. "Most people do," Ethan said. He gestured to Eliza and Molly. They moved. He followed, putting himself between them and the men without making a production of it, just positioning. Like a man naturally falls into when he's been in enough situations to know where danger tends to come from. Consequence was still at the post. Molly looked at the horse with the involuntary attention. Children gave to animals even in the middle of terrible things, and Ethan said, "Her name's Consequence." Molly said, without looking away from the horse, "Why?" And Ethan said, "Long story," and that was almost the beginning of something. That small exchange, though none of them knew it yet. They moved through the edge of Black Hollow without being stopped. People watched from windows and doorways. He could feel the watching, but nobody stepped out. Nobody called after them. The town had learned its particular brand of silence, and it held that silence now. He didn't ask Eliza what she'd signed, or whether she'd had any choice, or what her husband had left her when he died, because he could see from the set of her shoulders and the way she walked fast, efficient, not looking left or right, that she was past the kind of shock that needed tending right now. She was running on something harder than shock, the kind of thing that kept you upright when everything else said sit down. Molly walked beside her mother, matching her pace with the short-legged determination of a child who'd been keeping up with adults her whole life. Ethan led Consequence and didn't say anything. The road east out of Black Hollow was rutted and dry, and the wind off the plains was cold enough to make your eyes water. Above them the sky was the wide, pale blue of Montana in autumn, the kind of sky that made the world feel both enormous and very close at the same time. He didn't know yet what he was riding into. He thought he was helping a woman get home safe so he could turn around and find his milk cow. He was wrong about that. But that was the thing about turning corners in towns you'd never been to. You didn't know what you were walking into until you were already inside it. And by then, usually it was too late to go back. Consequence snorted at a gust of wind and kept walking. Molly reached out, without looking, and put her small hand briefly on the horse's neck, not patting, just touching, the way you touch something solid when the ground under your feet isn't as steady as it should be. Ethan saw that and didn't say anything. He just kept walking. Behind them, Black Hollow settled back into its waiting silence. And somewhere on the far side of that silence, in the big house on the edge of town, with the good curtains and the bad history, Gideon Voss was already hearing what had happened at the feed store. And the look on his face, they said later, was not anger, interest, which was, everyone in Black Hollow knew, considerably worse. The Whitmore Ranch was not what Ethan had expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected exactly. 6 miles east of Black Hollow, the road narrowed to a pair of wheel ruts pressed into dry grass, and then the ruts curved around a low hill, and the ranch came into view a main house, barn that leaned slightly to the south, as if tired of standing straight, a chicken coop, 3 fence lines in varying states of repair, and a well with a rope that had been spliced in 2 places. It was the kind of place that had been worked hard and loved harder, and was currently losing both battles. Eliza didn't say anything when they came over the rise, and the ranch appeared. She just kept walking, her pace unchanged, her eyes forward. But Molly exhaled a long, slow breath, and her shoulders dropped about an inch, and Ethan understood that this place, whatever its condition, was the thing that child measured safety against. They were home, which meant for now they were safe. For now was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Eliza pushed open the front door. It stuck. She had to shoulder it. She did this without pausing, like a woman who had shouldered that door 10,000 times and went directly to the kitchen. Ethan stopped in the doorway, not entering until she looked back and gave him the kind of nod that wasn't an invitation so much as a permission, the difference being important to a woman in her situation. He came in. He took off his hat. He did not sit down. Kitchen was clean, in the way things are clean when someone has very little and takes care of all of it. Cast iron pan hanging on a hook, a tin coffee pot, table with 3 chairs, the third one smaller than the others, pushed back slightly from the table, as if Molly always sat just outside the main conversation. Molly sat in that chair now and watched Ethan with open, unself-conscious attention, the way children look at things they haven't categorized yet. "You hungry?" Eliza said. She was at the stove already, not waiting for the answer. "You don't have to. I know I don't," she said. "Are you hungry?" "Yes," he said. She nodded once and started working. Ethan stood by the door and watched the room and said nothing, which was the right call. He had a sense he'd had it since the feed store, since she'd given him her name, like she was deciding something that Eliza Whitmore was not a woman who processed things by talking about them. She processed them by moving, by doing the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that, until she'd put enough distance between herself and whatever happened that she could look at it from a safer angle. He could respect that. Molly, however, had no such system. "Those men work for Mr. Voss," she said. "Not a question," seemed like Ethan said. "He owns the Hendersons' old place now, and the Garcias' place, and the 2 parcels north of the creek." She said it, the way children delivered facts completely, without editorial, as if the information had weight and needed to be put somewhere. "Mama says he owns most of the county by now." "Molly," Eliza said, not sharply, just her name. Molly looked at her mother, then back at Ethan, folded her hands on the table. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Ethan turned his hat in his hands. "I came to buy a milk cow," he said. "You said that already." "It's still true. There's a milk cow in the barn," Molly said. "She's ours, but we haven't been selling her milk because we need it. Mama says we might have to sell her before winter if things don't." She stopped, looked at her mother's back, finished more quietly, "if things don't work out." Eliza set a bowl down in front of the empty chair at the table and looked at Ethan. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him with her own bowl and nothing else, and for a few minutes the only sound was eating, and the wind working at the corner of the house where the chinking had gone soft. Molly ate about half her food and then sat watching Ethan with the bowl still in front of her, apparently having decided he was more interesting than supper. "You're not afraid of them," Molly said. Same tone, just the name. "It's a real question," Molly said to her mother, then back to Ethan. "Everyone in town is afraid of Mr. Voss's men, even the ones who won't say they are. You weren't." Ethan thought about how to answer that honestly. "I was," he said. "I just didn't have time to stop and think about it." Molly considered this. "Is that bravery?" "I think bravery usually looks like that," he said. "From the inside, anyway. From the outside, it probably looks different." Molly nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. Eliza was looking at him, now had been looking at him for most of this conversation. He realized with an expression he still couldn't entirely read. Not warm, not cold. Careful. The way you look at something that might be useful and might also be a problem. "You should go," she said, "after you eat. Take the road back west before dark. The men from this morning will report to Voss. Yes. He'll want to know who you are." She put her spoon down. "If you're still in the county when he finds out, it'll be worse for you. What about you?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Eliza looked at it like she'd been expecting it, and had already prepared several responses, none of which she particularly liked. "That's not your concern," she said. "It's a little bit my concern," he said. "I hit 3 of his men." "You did," she agreed. "Which is why you should go." Ethan set his own spoon down. He looked at the table, then at her. "What did you sign?" he said. "Back there, before I came around that corner, those papers he put in front of you." The silence that followed had texture to it. Molly stopped pretending to eat. Eliza's jaw moved once, a small adjustment, like she was relocating something inside her mouth that had gotten in the way. "Transfer of deed," she said, "to this property. Your ranch. My ranch, under duress. Under his definition of voluntary agreement, yes." Ethan looked at her. "That can be contested." "By who?" She said it without bitterness, which made it worse. The flat, factual question. "The sheriff? Judge Alderman? Every man of legal standing in this county takes dinner at Gideon Voss's table at least twice a month." She picked up her spoon again, then set it down again. "I've looked at every door, Mr. Walker. They're all locked from his side." "Not every door," Ethan said. She looked at him. You don't know this county. No, he said, but I know that a signed document under coercion has problems. And I know that if there are other people he's done this to. There are, Molly said. Molly? There are, Molly said again, quieter but not retreating. The Hendersons said so before they left. Mrs. Garcia told Mrs. Pruitt at the dry goods, and I heard it. He does it to everyone, Mama. You know he does. Eliza looked at her daughter for a long moment. Something passed across her face, not quite pain, something more complicated than pain. The particular expression of a mother who has been trying to protect a child from truths the child has already found on their own. Yes, she said finally. He does. Ethan looked between them. He thought about the road back to Silver Creek, about Consequence in the barn probably already having made friends with the milk cow, about his own house, 6 miles up from the creek bed, with the roof he'd been meaning to patch since August. He thought about the papers he'd be riding away from, and Molly's voice saying, Are you going to stay? And the man in the black coat stepping through a door he hadn't knocked on. Tell me about Voss, he said. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed her bowl aside and folded her hands on the table, and she told him. Gideon Voss had come to Black Hollow 11 years ago with cash money and a lawyer and a patience that people had initially mistaken for good nature. He'd bought the old Briggs property at a fair price. Everyone agreed on that, and he'd run cattle well and kept his fences maintained and shown up to the occasional town meeting. For 3 years he was, by most accounts, a decent enough neighbor. Then the drought hit. 18 months of it, the kind that turned creeks to mud and mud to dust and made men do things at their kitchen tables late at night that their families didn't know about. Voss didn't suffer in the drought. He'd been buying water rights quietly for 2 years before it started, which struck people afterward as either very smart or very knowing, depending on how charitable you were feeling. He made offers on struggling properties. Fair offers at first, not generous, but fair. Then, as the drought wore on and options narrowed, the offers got less fair, and the pressure behind them got more visible. Fence line that mysteriously got cut, cattle that wandered onto neighboring properties and did damage. A rumor started here, a word dropped there, and somehow a man who'd been getting credit from the bank for 15 years found his credit pulled the same month. Voss made an offer on his land. Eliza's husband, Thomas, had been one of the first to see it clearly. He'd started talking to the other ranchers, started putting together a picture of what Voss was doing across the county. He'd gotten his hands on some documents, she didn't say how, and Ethan didn't ask, that showed a pattern. Money moving in ways that didn't match Voss's public accounts, signatures on land transfers that didn't add up right. Then Thomas went out to check the east fence one morning and didn't come back. They found his horse wandering 2 miles from the ranch. They found Thomas at the bottom of a ravine, and the official account was that his horse had spooked and thrown him and he'd hit his head on the rocks going down. The official account was delivered by the sheriff, who had by that point received enough of Voss's money that it had become a structural element of his character. Eliza said all of this in the same flat, steady voice she'd used when she told him about the transfer of deed. She didn't look away from him while she spoke, and she didn't soften any of it. And Ethan thought that this was a woman who had been carrying this specific weight for long enough that she'd stopped flinching under it. Molly had heard this before. She sat very still and looked at the table. The documents Thomas found, Ethan said. Where are they? Eliza looked at him. You kept them, he said. Not a question. She took a breath. Under the barn floor, she said, in a metal box. 3rd board from the south wall, loose nail on the right side. Ethan sat back. She had kept them. For 2 years, with Voss's pressure increasing, and the sheriff in his pocket, and every legal avenue closed, she had kept a box of evidence under her barn floor, and stayed on her property, and raised her daughter, and held on with both hands to something she couldn't use and couldn't let go of. Why didn't you? He started. Because he told me if I showed those documents to anyone, Molly would be taken from me. She said it without looking at Molly, keeping her eyes on Ethan. He said there were ways to make a court decide a widow without resources was unfit. He said he'd been patient with me out of respect for Thomas, but his patience had limits. Her hands were flat on the table, but very still. He wasn't wrong about the court. And I couldn't, she stopped. Started again. I couldn't risk her. Ethan looked at Molly, who was looking at her mother with an expression so adult it sat wrong on a 7-year-old's face, the expression of a child who has understood more than she was supposed to and has been quietly carrying that understanding alone. She knows, Eliza said, following his gaze. She figured most of it out on her own. A pause. She's like Thomas that way. Molly didn't say anything. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on her mother's folded hands, then pulled it back. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the gap in the chinking and made the flame in the oil lamp shudder. Somewheres in the barn, Consequence shifted her weight, and one of the boards creaked in response. Ethan stood up and carried his bowl to the basin. He stood there with his back to them for a moment, looking at the wall above the basin, where there was a small rectangle of slightly lighter paint, where something had hung for a long time and been taken down. He turned around. I need to look at those documents, he said. Tonight? Eliza said. You signed papers today. He'll move fast now. He doesn't have any reason to wait anymore. She looked at him with that careful, measuring expression. You said you came here to buy a cow. I did. And now you're talking about evidence and legal documents, and she stopped. Why? You don't owe us anything. You helped us today, and that's more than anyone else has done. But you could ride out tonight and be back in Silver Creek by morning, and Voss would never have cause to look your direction. Ethan leaned against the basin and crossed his arms. You ever see a dog that's been tied up so long, it forgets it can pull the stake out of the ground? She blinked. What? The stake's not that deep, he said. But the dog stopped trying. So it just sits there in a circle of worn-down ground. Stared at him. That's what you think this is? No, he said. I think this is a woman who had no help and made the best choices she could with what she had. I think the ground is harder here than most places. He uncrossed his arms. I'm just saying the stake's not as deep as Voss wants you to think. A long silence. The documents might not be enough on their own, she said. Even if we could get them to someone Voss doesn't have in his pocket. They're a circuit judge? Federal, not county, she thought. Judge Harrywell out of Billings. He comes through twice a year. Thomas mentioned him, said he was the one man in the territory Voss hadn't managed to reach. When's he due through? I don't know. 6 weeks, maybe 8. That's time, Ethan said. It's also time for Voss to make it so there's nothing left to bring to a judge. She stood up, pulled her shawl tighter. He owns the sheriff, Mr. Walker. He could have men here tomorrow with a legal writ and a reason to pull that barn apart plank by plank. Then we get to the documents before he does. She looked at him for a long time. The lamp flickered. Molly had turned in her chair to watch this exchange, with the intent focus of someone following a game whose rules she was still learning. We, Eliza said. The word was flat, just sitting there. If you want, Ethan said. She looked down at the table, then at her hands, then at Molly. Molly looked back at her, and what passed between them was the language that developed between two people who'd had no one else to talk to, for a long time compressed. Efficient, a whole conversation in a glance. Eliza looked at Ethan. The barn, she said. Come on. The night air had gone cold fast, the way Montana nights did, a clean, sharp cold that came off the mountains and didn't apologize. They crossed the yard with the lamp, Ethan a step behind Eliza, Molly close behind him, despite the fact that Eliza had told her twice to stay in the house. The barn smelled of horse and old hay, and the particular dry wood smell of a structure that had been standing long enough to develop its own character. Consequence made a quiet sound when Ethan came in, recognizing him, and the milk cow in the neighboring stall, brown and white, older but solid-looking, turned a slow, incurious eye toward the lamp. Eliza moved directly to the south wall, counted boards, third from the wall, and when she pressed the loose nail on the right side and lifted, The board came up with a groan that sounded like it had been waiting to make that sound for a long time. She reached in and pulled out a metal box. Not large, the kind of box a man used to keep receipts or small tools. It was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord. She held it out to Ethan, took it. The weight of it was ordinary papers, didn't weigh much, but the way she handed it over was the kind of gesture that didn't happen lightly, the handing over of something you've been holding alone for 2 years in the dark. He untied the cord and unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the box. Inside were perhaps 40 pages, some handwritten, some printed forms with filled-in fields. Land transfer records, several of them, each with signatures that Thomas had annotated in the margins in tight, careful handwriting. Financial records showing movement of money between accounts. 3 letters, unsigned, but written in the same hand, discussing the disposal of properties and the specific timing of pressure applied to individual owners. And at the bottom, a diagram hand-drawn, careful mapping Voss's land acquisitions across the county against dates of drought, bank credit withdrawals, and the deaths or departures of previous owners. Thomas Whitmore had been thorough, more than thorough. He had understood exactly what he was building, and he had built it with the patience of a man who knew he'd only get one chance to be believed. Ethan looked through it slowly, in the lamplight, with the barn cold around him, and the sounds of the animals, and Eliza standing 2 feet away, watching his face. He was a careful man, Ethan said. Yes, she said. This is enough, he said. Not for a county sheriff, but for a federal judge. He looked up at her. This is enough. Eliza's breath came out of her in a slow, controlled way, like a woman who had been holding something compressed in her chest for a long time and had just been told she was allowed to let a little of it go. Her eyes were dry. He got the sense she'd moved past the stage of things that produced tears a long time ago. But something changed in her face. Not relief. Relief was too easy a word for it. More like the moment when you've been pushing against a wall for so long that when it finally shifts a 1/4 inch, your whole body has to adjust to the new geometry. He'll know we have it, she said. If we try to use it, he'll know. He already suspects you have something, Ethan said. That's why he's been pressing to get you off this property. The land is part of it, but the land isn't all of it. He looked at the diagram Thomas had drawn. He wants this gone. Molly had come to stand beside her mother at some point during this, and now she was looking at the papers in Ethan's hands, with an expression that mixed things that shouldn't coexist, in a child's face, comprehension and fury, and a grief that had been sitting so long inside her it had started to calcify. That's Papa's writing, she said. Yes, Eliza said. Molly reached out and touched the edge of one page, just the corner, with one finger. She didn't take it, just touched it. He knew, she said. He knew all of it, and he was going to... She stopped. Yes, Eliza said again, softer. Ethan rewrapped the box in the oilcloth and tied it back and held it out to Eliza. She took it and held it against her chest with both arms, and they stood there in the barn in the lamplight for a moment that didn't need any conversation. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, Ethan said. If that's all right. She looked at him. He might send men tonight, Ethan said, or he might wait. But I'd rather be here than not. You're one man, she said. I'm aware of that. Against Voss and however many men he decides to send. Also aware. She studied him with that calculating look. You're not doing this because you want something from me. It was said plainly, the way a woman who'd been alone on a frontier ranch for 2 years asked a question she needed answered. No, he said. I'm not. She looked at him long enough to decide whether she believed that. The loft's got hay, she said. There's a blanket on the hook inside the door. She took Molly and went back to the house. And Ethan stood in the barn and listened to the sounds of the night and thought about what he'd gotten himself into, which was considerably more than he'd bargained for when he left Silver Creek 4 days ago looking for a milk cow. In the morning, Ethan was awake before the light. Not because anything woke him, no sound, no movement, but because he'd slept like a man who expected to be woken and therefore wasn't, and his body had simply decided that 4 hours was enough and offered him consciousness whether he wanted it or not. climbed down from the loft, and checked on Consequence Fine, already awake, giving him a look that communicated her feelings about barn accommodations, and walked out into the gray pre-dawn yard. The house was dark. The road that ran east from the property was empty. He stood there in the cold and thought about Black Hollow, about the man in the black coat walking through a door he hadn't knocked on, about 4 men with a document and a grip on a woman's wrist. He thought about a metal box wrapped in oilcloth and 40 pages of careful handwriting that could unravel an empire. And he thought about 6 weeks, maybe 8, before a federal judge came through on his circuit. A lot could happen in 6 weeks. He was still standing there, thinking when the sound came not from the road, from the north, from the direction of the creek bed, where the ground was soft enough to muffle hoofbeats if you knew the terrain. Just the faintest disruption of the normal pre-dawn quiet, the kind of sound you only heard if you'd been listening for it. He went back into the barn at a walk and saddled Consequence without a lamp, working by feel. He slid his rifle out of its scabbard and checked it, and laid it across the stall rail, and then went to the barn door and stood just inside it, looking out toward the north. Sky was beginning to pale at the east edge. They came out of the creek bed at a jog. 4 horses, no lamps, riding in a spread formation, not Voss's regular men. Or not only, these moved differently, tighter, with the practiced ease of men who'd done this kind of work at this kind of hour before. Ethan picked up his rifle. He didn't fire. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled one sharp note, loud, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a crack in ice. The horses stopped. He could see the riders now as shapes against the paling sky, 4 of them pulling up and looking toward the barn where the whistle had come from. The lights came on in the house. First one window, then another. The front door opened. "I'd turn around," Ethan called. His voice carried flat and clear in the still air. "Whatever he's paying you, it doesn't cover being the first one through that door." A long pause. The 4 shapes held their positions. "Voss will hear about this," one of them called back. "Seems like he already knows enough to send you," Ethan said. "Ride back and tell him the ranch is occupied. Tell him the documents he's looking for are not here." A pause. "Tell him if he wants to settle this, he can do it in town, in front of people." Another pause. The shapes conferred. He could see movement, heads tilting toward each other. What he'd said about the documents was a lie. A deliberate one, and Voss would probably know it was a lie. But it introduced a variable, a question that would slow down the next move by at least a few hours. The riders turned and went back the way they'd come, at the same jog, silent. Ethan stood in the barn door until the sound of hoofbeats faded back into the creek bed and the morning was quiet again. His heart was going fast, which he noticed with the detached interest of a man who had learned to observe his own fear, rather than be governed by it. The front door of the house was still open. Eliza was standing in it, silhouetted against the interior light, the metal box in her arms. He grabbed it first, he realized. When the whistle woke her, before she came to the door, she'd gone for the box. He walked across the yard. 4 men, he said. "I saw. They'll be back. With more, and with something legal enough to get the sheriff involved." She looked at the box in her arms, then at him. "How long do we have?" Ethan looked east, where the sky was going from gray to the deep cold pink of a Montana dawn. "Today," he said. "Maybe tomorrow morning if we're lucky." Eliza nodded once. The kind of nod that came before a decision, not after it. "Molly," she called, without looking away from Ethan. From somewhere in the house, Molly's voice, already getting dressed. Eliza almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it came close. She heard the whistle too, she said. "Smart kid." "Too smart," Eliza said, the way parents said it, half complaint, half pride. The whole thing too complicated to be either. She looked at the road going west, back toward Black Hollow, where Gideon Voss was starting his day in the house, with the good curtains and the bad history, and she looked at the box in her arms. She looked at Ethan. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we do next." Plan, such as it was, had 3 parts, and depended on all 3 working in sequence. which Ethan acknowledged was the kind of plan that looked clean on the front end and got complicated the moment it met reality. First, get the documents out of the county, or at least to someone Voss couldn't silence before they reached Judge Harrowell in Billings. Second, find out when the judge was due through and get word to him directly, bypassing every local channel Voss had already bought. Third, stay alive long enough for it to matter. Ethan explained this to Eliza while they stood in the kitchen drinking coffee that was mostly hot water with ambitions, and she listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the table, and when he finished, she said, "Who do you trust in this county?" "Nobody," he said. "I've been here less than a day." "Who do I trust?" she said, correcting herself. "That's the question." She thought for a moment. "Ruth Alderman," she said. "The judge's wife. Not the county judge, different family. She runs the dry goods with her sister. She's never had cause to be friendly with Voss, and she's got a sister in Billings who writes letters." "That's something," Ethan said. "It's a thread," Eliza said. "Not a rope. Threads are what you start with." Molly came downstairs with her hair unbraided and her boots on the wrong feet, noticed the boots, sat down on the bottom step, switched them without comment, stood back up. She looked at the two adults in the kitchen, assessing what kind of morning this was going to be, and apparently decided the assessment was unnecessary. "We're going to town," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Not yet," Ethan said, "but today. Maybe today." Molly looked at her mother. Eliza looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his coffee. "Yes," Eliza said. "Today." They left the ranch before full light, which meant the road was still half dark, and the cold had settled into a wet kind of cold that came off the creek and got into your joints and stayed there. Eliza had wrapped the metal box in 2 layers of oilcloth and tucked it into the bottom of a flour sack, buried under actual flour, which she then tied off and put in the back of the wagon. It was the kind of hiding that wouldn't survive a determined search, but would survive a casual one. Ethan rode Consequence alongside the wagon. He'd cleaned up the cut on his cheekbone as best he could, which wasn't very well, and the bruise had gone from red to purple overnight in the way bruises did when they were settling in for a long stay. His ribs hurt when he breathed deep, which meant either one was cracked or the muscle around it was angry. He breathed shallow and didn't mention it. Molly sat beside her mother on the wagon bench, the road ahead, with the focused attention of a child who had decided she was going to be useful and was trying to figure out how. "If Voss's men are watching the road," Eliza said quietly, not looking at him. "They will be," Ethan said. "Question is where." "There's a cutoff," she said. "Half-mile before town, goes through the Pelham property. It's empty now, Pelham sold last year. Comes out behind the livery. Does Voss know it?" "He knows everything," she said, "but it's less obvious than the main road." Cutoff. The Pelham property was exactly what empty frontier land became when nobody was looking after it. The fence posts still standing, but the wire between them sagging and broken. The house dark with its door hanging open an inch. The yard already going back to grass and scrub. Consequence picked her way through carefully. The wagon wheels found every rut. They came out behind the livery, as Eliza had said, at the back of Black Hollow, and Ethan pulled Consequence to a stop and looked at the town's backside, the outhouses and woodpiles, and the unpainted rear walls of the buildings that faced the main road, and listened for anything that sounded like they'd been anticipated. The town sounded like mourning. Someone splitting wood, a dog somewhere, the creak and clank of the livery. "Ruth's Dry Goods is on the south end of Main Street," Eliza said. "I know where it is," Molly said. "I wasn't talking to you," Eliza said, not unkindly. They came around to the main street from the south, which put them at the far end from Voss's main operations, the land office he effectively controlled, the sheriff's building, the hotel where his men drank. Ethan had noted the geography yesterday, the quick survey of a man who always wanted to know which direction led out. Ruth Alderman's Dry Goods occupied a narrow building with a wide porch, and Ruth herself was sweeping that porch when they pulled up a compact woman in her 60s with iron gray hair, pulled back hard, and eyes that had the permanently skeptical look of someone who'd been selling things to people for 40 years. knew what they actually needed versus what they said they wanted. She saw Eliza and her broom slowed. She saw Ethan and it stopped entirely. She looked at Molly with something softer, then back at Eliza with an expression that recombined into careful professional neutrality. "Eliza," she said, "you look like you had a hard night." "I had a hard yesterday," Eliza said. "The night was just long." Ruth glanced up the street. Not a nervous glance, a practiced one. Automatic. The survey of a woman who had learned to know where Voss's men were positioned without appearing to check. "Better come inside," she said. The dry goods store had that particular smell of combined things, flour and tobacco and leather, and the cedar blocks Ruth used in the cloth section, and it was a smell Eliza clearly found grounding because something in her posture changed slightly when the door closed behind them. Not relaxed, just recalibrated. Ruth led them to the back, past the shelves and the counter, into a small storeroom with boxes and bags stacked to the ceiling, and a single chair that Molly was directed to with a pointed look. Molly sat in it. "What did you sign?" Ruth said to Eliza. "Directly. No preamble. Transfer of deed," Eliza said. Ruth closed her eyes for about 2 seconds. Opened them. He pushed the timeline up. Yesterday morning. His men came to enforce it in the afternoon. Eliza looked at Ethan. That's when Mr. Walker got involved. Ruth looked at Ethan fully for the first time. He let her look. "You're the one who put Cale Duggan face first into the feed store wall," she said. "He threw the first punch," Ethan said. "That's not a denial." "No, it's not." Ruth looked at him for another moment, then made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same direction. "Duggan's had that wall coming for 3 years, she said. She turned back to Eliza. "The deed transfer under duress. Thomas had notes on the legal argument for that, didn't he?" Eliza's expression shifted. "You knew about Thomas's documents." "Thomas talked to me," Ruth said. "Before. He was careful about who he talked to, but he needed to know about Harrowell, about when the judge was coming through, and how to get to him without it going through county channels." She paused. "I'm the one who gave him Harrowell's schedule." The storeroom got quiet for a moment. Molly was looking at Ruth with that same adult comprehension, filing things away. "When is Harrowell coming through?" Ethan said. "He's not," Ruth said. "Not on the regular schedule. He wrote to postpone circuit court business, and Helena pushed everything back 6 weeks. Eliza said nothing. The silence had weight. But Ruth said, and the word had something behind it. "I had a letter from my sister in Billings 4 days ago. Harrowell's clerk is a man named Cord, and Cord happens to board at my sister's house. He told her Harrowell has been getting inquiries from 2 other counties about Voss's land practices. He's aware something is developing. He'd come early if he had cause." "Cause meaning evidence," Ethan said. "Cause meaning a formal complaint supported by documentation, delivered by someone credible who'd swear to it in open court." Ruth looked at Ethan. "Take it. That's what's in that flour sack." Eliza looked at the flour sack in her arms. Then at Ruth. "How did you—" "You didn't come in here carrying actual flour," Ruth said. She held out her hand. Eliza hesitated. 1 breath, 2, and then she set the sack on the storeroom's small work table, and Ruth unwrapped it and opened the box and looked through the papers. For perhaps 3 minutes, moving through them with the efficiency of a woman who could read a situation as fast as she could read a bill of sale. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Something behind her eyes had gone hard and certain. "Thomas was thorough," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. "This is enough." Ruth looked at Ethan. "This is enough for Harrowell, if we get it to him." "How fast can your sister get a letter to Cord?" Ethan said. 3 days to Billings by post rider." Ruth was already thinking through it. He could see the calculation working across her face. "But Cord can't receive official documents. For the judge, there's a protocol. Harrowell would need to receive the complaint in person or through his official clerk in a formal setting. Meaning someone has to go to Billings," Ethan said, "or get Harrowell to come here, which he would if the complaint were delivered through the right channel." Ruth looked at Eliza. "There's a man named Arthur Price. He's a lawyer in Billings, legitimate, and he's had dealings with Harrowell's court before. If Price were to bring this material to Harrowell as a formal complaint, with a request for emergency circuit session. Vos knows Price, Eliza said. Thomas mentioned him. He said Price was the one honest lawyer in the territory. Voss hadn't gotten to. Which is exactly why Voss will be watching for anyone heading to Billings, Ethan said. If he suspects the documents are being moved. He already suspects, Ruth said. He's been waiting 2 years for Eliza to make a move. She looked at the box on the table. Question is how you get this out of the county without him intercepting it. Ethan thought for a moment. He thought about the road to Billings, which ran north through 2 mountain passes, and about the riders who'd come to the ranch in the pre-dawn hours, and about the way Voss had looked, or the way Eliza described him looking in her doorway that morning with the transfer papers. Interest, she'd said. The look on his face was interest. A man who found things interesting stayed ahead of them. The documents shouldn't travel as themselves, Ethan said. Ruth looked at him. Copies? 2 copies, different routes. The original stays here, hidden somewhere Voss won't connect to any of us. He looked at Eliza. If he searches the ranch and finds nothing, it slows him down. If he catches a rider to Billings and finds nothing, he'll know someone's playing a longer game, Eliza said. He'll push harder. Yes, Ethan said, but by then the copies are already in Billings. Quiet for a moment. Molly said from the chair. Everyone looked at her. She looked back at them with the particular expression of a child who has sat quietly long enough and has something to contribute. Papa taught me. Proper writing, not just letters. I can copy documents. Eliza opened her mouth. She can, Ruth said before Eliza could say anything. She was looking at Molly with what might have been calculation, and might have been something warmer than that. Children's writing doesn't look forged. If we need copies that don't look official. She's 7, Eliza said. She's 7 who can write, Molly said. Ruth looked at Eliza with an expression that said she understood the objection and overruled it anyway. We have time this morning, before Voss's men start making their rounds. Question is where the copies go, and who carries them. Ethan had been working through this. You said 2 other counties have been sending inquiries to Harrowell about Voss's practices. Ruth nodded. Names? Sheriff Aldous Cray in Whitfield County. He's clean. Old man. Been in the position 20 years. Voss never managed to get to him, because Whitfield's too far north to be worth the trouble. And there's a Ranchers Association in Palmer County, western edge of the territory. They filed a formal grievance through the Territorial Assembly last spring, but it got buried. They had documentation, Ethan said. It changes what's buried, Ruth said. Then the copies go 2 directions. One to Price in Billings, one to Cray in Whitfield. Not together, not the same route, not the same day. Ruth looked at him steadily. You're thinking like a man who's done this before. I've moved cattle through contested territory, he said. Same principle. You don't send the whole herd on one road. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Who carries them? I'll take the Billings route, Ethan said. I'm already a known problem. Voss's men will be watching for me, which means if I move obviously, they'll follow me and not look for whoever takes the northern route. You're offering yourself as a distraction, Eliza said. Her voice was careful. I'm offering myself as the obvious threat, he said. There's a difference. Not much of one, if they catch you. No, he agreed. Not much. Ruth looked between them. I can find a carrier for the northern route. There's a man Hicks, runs Quant freight between here and Whitfield twice a month. He's not brave, but he's not stupid, and he's got no love for Voss, because Voss tried to buy out his freight contract 2 years ago, and Hicks told him where to put the offer. She paused. If I explain what's at stake, he'll carry it. He won't know what's in it. Good, Ethan said. The less he knows, the less there is to find. They started on the copies immediately, there in the storeroom, with Ruth producing paper and 2 pens and an ink bottle from a drawer. Molly came off the chair without being told and stood at the table and looked at the documents with Thomas's handwriting on them. Her father's tight, careful hand, and something moved across her face that she put away quickly and efficiently, the way she was apparently learning to do with things that hurt. And then she picked up a pen. She wrote slowly. Deliberately, her tongue just slightly between her teeth, and her handwriting was genuinely a child's uneven, a little large, but it was legible. And when she copied one of Thomas's annotated transfer records with careful fidelity, getting all the numbers right, Ethan looked at it and thought that Thomas Whitmore had taught his daughter well, and hadn't known why. And that was the kind of thing that sat heavy if you let it. He didn't let it. There wasn't time. Eliza copied the other documents in her own hand, quick and clean. Ruth organized them, noted which pages went in which packet. Ethan stood by the storeroom door, listening to the sounds of the street. It was halfway through this work that the front door of the dry goods opened. All four of them went still that instant, absolute stillness of people engaged in something they need to not be seen doing. Ruth straightened up and walked out of the Storford Rissenroom, pulling the door to behind her, and they heard her voice in the shop, pleasant and unhurried. "Morning, Frank. Can I get you?" A man's voice low, the sound of boots on the floorboards. Ethan moved to put himself beside the storeroom door, between it and Eliza, who had already pulled Molly behind her. He did not reach for his gun. Not yet. The conversation in the shop was brief, something about nails, a quantity, a price, and then boots going out, and the door closing. Pause. Ruth came back into the storeroom. "Frank Lester," she said. "He works the livery. He's not one of Voss's men." A pause. "Talks. How long have we been here?" Ethan said. Ruth checked the clock on the shelf. 40 minutes. "We need to finish and move." They finished in another 20 minutes. Molly, writing the last page with the same focused deliberateness she'd brought to the first. And then Ruth packed the two sets of copies into separate wrappers, not the flour sack. Plain brown paper sealed with wax, and the originals went back in the metal box. Question of where to put the box had been sitting in the room, unaddressed. "Not the ranch," Ethan said. "He'll search it." "Not here," Ruth said. "If he connects me to this, I lose the store and worse." Eliza was looking at the wall with an expression of working through something. "Pelham property," she said. "The house is empty. There's a root cellar in the yard, behind the woodshed. I know it because Thomas and Pelham used it for storing equipment during floods. The cellar stays dry even when the yard floods. Nobody uses it now." "If Voss searches Pelham property," Ethan said, "why would he search a property he already owns?" Eliza said. The logic of that settled in the room. Ruth looked at Eliza with something that was hard to name. Respect was part of it, and something older and more tired than respect. "All right," she said. "The Pelham cellar." She handed one of the brown paper packets to Ethan. The other she kept herself, for Hicks, the freight man, who she'd reach by the afternoon and who wouldn't know what he was carrying and would take the northern road to Whitfield before sunset. Ethan put the packet inside his coat. He could feel it against his chest, next to the still tender ribs. Outside the dry goods, he stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the main street of Black Hollow, the dusty road, the buildings, people moving through their day with the particular careful normalcy of people who'd learned not to look at certain things. He thought about what this town had looked like from the ridge when he'd ridden in yesterday morning, how ordinary it had seemed. Ordinary was a thing a place could wear, like a coat he'd found. It didn't tell you what was underneath. Eliza came to stand beside him. Molly was inside still, Ruth, showing her something at the counter, with the abstracted generosity of a woman who had no children of her own and knew it. "The Pelhamson cellar," Ethan said. "We should do that on the way out of town, not after. If anyone's watching, we don't want to come back through." "Agreed," she said. He looked at her profile. She was watching the street. "The northern route to Whitfield," he said. "If Hicks gets the packet through, if when," he said. "And if Price and Billings takes the complaint to Harrowell." "But still a lot of ifs," she said. "Most things worth doing are." She was quiet for a moment. "You said you'd take the Billings route," she said, as the distraction. "Yes. That means you ride out of here in a direction Voss's men can see. Follow. That's the idea." She looked at him then. Straight on, the way she'd looked at him in the barn, that careful, Measuring look that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't comfortable either. The look of a woman who had gotten to this place in her life by being accurate about people. You could just go home, she said. You have the option of going home. I know, he said. I'm not sure I understand why you're not taking it. He thought about how to answer that. He scratched the back of his neck, which was his tell, and he knew it. I grew up in a town not so different from this one, he said. Different state. Different man wearing the black coat. The same, you know what I mean. He looked at the street. I left that town when I was 19 because I thought leaving was surviving, and I survived. He stopped. I've been surviving for 17 years. I'm getting tired of being good at it. She looked at him for a long moment. He expected the look to be calculating, but it wasn't. It was something closer to recognition. All right, she said. They got Molly from inside, and Ruth pressed a small bundle of food on them, biscuits wrapped in cloth, and the three of them went out the back door into the alley, and through the alley to the wagon, and they took the long way around to the Pelham property, with nobody following them that Ethan could see, though seeing was never the same as knowing. The Pelham root cellar was behind the woodshed, exactly as Eliza had said, its door lying flat in the ground, green with moss on the edges. Ethan pulled it open. Stone steps going down into a darkness that smelled of old earth and the particular mineral cold of deep ground. He took the metal box down and set it on the shelf against the far wall, on top of a piece of canvas already there, and pulled a crate in front of it. Then he came back up and let the door down flat. He looked at the ground around the cellar door for a moment. Then he found a flat piece of dry soil nearby and scraped it over the door's edges with his boot, not enough to look deliberate, just enough to blur the outline. Eliza watched this. You think he'll find it anyway? I think he'll look everywhere. Eventually, Ethan said. But eventually is what we're working with. We just need eventually to be long enough. Molly was standing at the edge of the Pelham yard, looking at the empty house with her arms wrapped around herself in the particular way she had when she was thinking about something she wasn't saying. Ethan came to stand near her. You okay? He said. He didn't say it the way adults said it to children when they expected the answer yes. He said it the way you ask someone you thought might have an honest answer. Molly considered. I think so, she said. Are you? More or less. Your face looks worse, she said. Feels about the same, he said, which is bad. She almost smiled. Papa used to say that, she said. More or less. When Mama asked him how he was. Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't from around here either, Molly said. He came from Ohio. Mama always said he showed up looking for something and found something completely different. She looked up at Ethan with those October-colored eyes she'd gotten from her mother. Do you think that's a pattern? People coming here looking for one thing? I'm beginning to think so, Ethan said. They left the Pelham property and came back to the wagon, and Ethan saddled Consequence and checked his rifle and his sidearm and made himself think clearly about the road ahead, which was the Billings Road, running north through open ground for the first 10 miles before it hit the foothills. Open ground meant visible. Visible meant Voss's men would pick him up within the first 2 miles. That was the point. That was what he was for. He walked Consequence to where Eliza sat on the wagon bench and stopped. Go east, he said. Not back to the ranch, yet take the creek road south and come around from below. It'll add 2 hours, but it'll be harder to follow. And when we get to the ranch, she said. Wait, he said. The wagon hitched. If men come that look like they mean it, don't wait for them to knock. He looked at Molly. You know the creek? Down to the Henderson Bridge, Molly said. Past the bridge there's a stand of cottonwoods. Deep on the east bank, he said. If you have to go, go there. Stay off the road. Molly nodded. Seriously, deliberately, storing it the same way she stored everything. Ethan looked at Eliza. She looked back at him. There was nothing romantic in the look. Nothing easy or simple, just the look of two people who had ended up standing on the same piece of ground for reasons neither of them had fully chosen, and who were now parting in a direction that neither of them was certain about, and who both knew it. Come back, she said. It was not said the way it was said in stories. It was said the way a practical woman stated, a practical requirement flat, unadorned, the way you said, bring back enough flour, the way you said, make sure the water doesn't freeze. Just come back. That's the plan, he said. Turned Consequence north and rode out of the Pelham property onto the Billings Road, into the open ground, into the wide October sky, where anyone watching could see him plain as a black mark on white paper. He had gone perhaps a mile when he heard it, the sound of horses behind him. 2 or 3, coming up from the south end of Black Hollow at a pace that said they weren't in a hurry because they didn't think he was going anywhere they couldn't follow. Ethan didn't look back. He kept riding. The packet against his chest was blank paper. He'd made that switch in the alley. Behind the dry goods, the real copy, tucked into the lining of his saddlebag, under 3 layers of gear, where a quick search wouldn't reach it. They stopped him and searched him. They'd find blank paper and be confused. And confusion bought minutes, and minutes bought distance. He didn't know if this was going to work. He knew that Thomas Whitmore had done everything a careful man could do, and it hadn't been enough. He knew that Gideon Voss had had 11 years to build something designed specifically to survive challenges like this one. He knew that he was one man on a road with other men behind him, and the road ahead was long, and the foothills were getting closer. But he knew something else too, something he'd seen in the dry goods storeroom, in a 7-year-old girl, with her tongue between her teeth and her father's documents in front of her, copying numbers in her large, careful hand, making herself useful in the only way available to her, and not complaining about the limitation. Thomas Whitmore had spent 2 years building a case because he believed it would matter. He'd hidden it and protected it and died before he could use it, and his wife had kept it for 2 more years in a box under a barn floor because she believed it too, even when belief was the only thing she had left to hold. Ethan was not a man who believed in much. He was a man who survived. He knew the difference. But riding north on the Billings Road with Voss's men behind him, and Thomas Whitmore's work in his saddlebag, he thought that maybe this once, surviving and believing, were pointed the same direction. He touched his heels to Consequence's sides, and she understood, and they moved from a walk to a trot, and the foothills came closer, and behind him the riders came on, and the sky above all of it was the wide pale blue of Montana in autumn. Indifferent and enormous and entirely beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you're not sure how much position to notice. The riders behind him were 3, and they weren't trying to close the distance fast. That told Ethan something. Fast pursuit meant stopping him was the priority. Steady pace meant following him was the priority, tracking where he went, who he met, what he was moving. Voss wanted to know the shape of the thing before he moved against it. That was how a patient man operated. That was how you built an 11-year empire. Ethan rode at a trot and let them keep their distance and thought about that. The Billings Road ran north through a wide-open valley for the first 8 miles, then narrowed where it entered the foothills, squeezing between 2 ridges before climbing to the first pass. He'd ridden this country before, years back, not from this direction but from the north, coming down from a job near the Canadian line. He remembered the ridges. He remembered that the eastern one had a shelf of rock about halfway up that looked down on the road for a good quarter mile. He had a decision to make before the foothills. If he kept going to Billings 3 days' ride, Voss's men would either take him on the road or wait until he reached Price's office and then have both of them. If he turned back, the packet in his saddlebag was wasted, and so was the day. If he could lose them in the foothills and double back by a different route, he could reach Billings a day behind schedule, with nobody watching his back. 3 options. The first 2 were bad. The third required the shelf of rock to be where he remembered it. He touched his heels to Consequence and moved her from a trot to an easy lope, the kind of acceleration that looked like impatience rather than intent. Behind him, the 3 riders matched the pace, keeping their interval. Good horses. Disciplined riders. Voss didn't hire cheap. The valley floor flattened out, and then the foothills rose up at the end of it, and the road entered the narrowsides between the ridges, and Ethan was into the shadow of them before the riders behind him, had cleared the last flat mile. The shade in the narrows was deep and cold, and the road was hard packed dirt between rock walls that threw back the sound of hoofbeats in a way that made it difficult to judge distance or direction. Ethan pulled Consequence off the road the moment the first bend hid him from sight behind him. Not a dramatic cut, just a steady, deliberate turn up the east slope through the scrub pine. Consequence didn't love the angle, but she was a good horse, which meant she complained with her ears and did it anyway. The shelf of rock was where he remembered it. He brought Consequence into the trees just below it and dismounted and stood listening. The three riders came into the narrows at a canter, which was faster than he'd expected someone, had made the calculation that losing him in the foothills was worse than being obvious about following. He heard them come around the bend, and then, slow, the sound of their horses changing as they registered the absence of the sound of his. He stood very still and kept his hand on Consequence's nose. Below him, through the trees, he could see the road as a pale strip between the dark rock walls. The three riders had stopped. One of them was reading the ground off his horse, crouching, looking at where Ethan had turned off the road. He was good. It took him about 45 seconds, which was faster than Ethan would have liked. The man stood up and said something to the other two, pointed up the east slope. Ethan had about a minute. He remounted, turned Consequence deeper into the trees, and moved parallel to the ridge rather than up it, staying in the pine cover and going as quietly as the terrain allowed. Behind him, he could hear the riders coming up the slope, less careful now, willing to make noise because speed mattered more than stealth at this point. The ridge ran north for about a mile before it dropped into a creek drainage that cut west. He knew or believed, which was not the same thing, that the drainage would come out on the far side of the foothills and rejoin a secondary road that ran to Billings from the west, adding half a day to the trip but bypassing the main pass entirely. He moved fast and didn't look back, and let Consequence pick her own path through the trees, which she did better than he'd have done, directing her. She was a better navigator than he was in broken terrain, and he'd learned years ago to trust that. The sound of pursuit behind him was steady for 20 minutes, and then it wasn't. He couldn't tell if they'd given up or split up. Splitting up was worse, because it meant one of them might know this country well enough to cut him off at the drainage. He found the drainage and followed it west, and it was rougher going than he'd remembered. Creek bed choked with deadfall, and the banks steep enough that Consequence had to pick her way, and he had to duck twice for branches that came at face height. His ribs made themselves known every time he twisted in the saddle. He ignored them with the practiced discipline of a man who'd been ignoring physical complaints for 36 years. The drainage opened onto the secondary road in the mid-afternoon, under a cold sky that had gone gray while he wasn't watching it. No riders on the road in either direction. He stopped Consequence and let her drink from the creek and stood beside her and ate one of the biscuits. Ruth had wrapped in cloth and thought about what was happening right now, back in Black Hollow. He thought about Eliza on the creek road south with Molly beside her, taking the long way home. He thought about Hicks, the freight man, and whether Ruth had reached him, and whether the northern packet was already on the road to Whitfield. He thought about a metal box in a root cellar behind a woodshed on a property Gideon Voss owned, without knowing what was in the ground beneath it. He turned Consequence north on the secondary road and rode. He made Billings in 2.5 days, pushing hard on the second day and sleeping rough in a draw. The second night, too exposed to risk a fire, wrapped in his bedroll with Consequence's warmth at his back. The cold had gone serious by the third morning, the kind of cold that was practicing for winter, and when he rode into Billings, it was under a skies the color of old pewter and a wind that came off the mountains with intent. Arthur Price's office was on the second floor of a brick building on the north side of town, up a flight of stairs that had a loose board on the third step. The sign on the door said Price and Associates, Attorneys at Law, and below it, in smaller letters, established 1871. The door was unlocked. The outer office was empty, except for a young man at a desk who looked up from his papers with the professionally composed expression of someone trained to not show surprise. "I need to see Price," Ethan said. "Mr. Price is with a client. Tell him it's about Gideon Voss and Black Hollow. Tell him a woman named Eliza Whitmore sent documentation." The young man looked at him for a moment with an expression that recalibrated visibly. Something in those words had landed differently than a cold stranger's demands usually did. He stood up without further argument and went through the interior door. Ethan waited. He was aware that he looked like something that had been dragged through the hills for 3 days, which was accurate. The interior door opened, and a man came out 50s, compact, with a neatly trimmed beard going gray, and the kind of eyes that had spent decades in courtrooms and knew how to read a room fast. He looked at Ethan, and his expression was careful and alert. "Arthur Price," he said. "Come in." Ethan came in. Price closed the door and gestured to a chair, which Ethan took, and Price sat across from him and folded his hands on the desk and waited. Ethan laid it out. All of it. In order, without editorializing the feed store, the ranch, the metal box, Thomas Whitmore's documents, Ruth Alderman, the Pelham cellar, the 2 copies going different directions. Put the packet from his saddlebag on Price's desks and watched Price open it and go through the copies. Price read carefully. He did not interrupt, turned pages back and reread sections, and his expression through all of this was the controlled expression of a man who was having a significant reaction and had the professional discipline to not let it show entirely. But not entirely was doing some work there, around the eyes, and the slight tightening of the jaw. Something was moving. When he finished, he looked up. "The originals are in Black Ridge County," he said, "in a root cellar. On a property Voss owns," Ethan said, "which is why he won't look there first." Price looked at the pages in front of him. "This diagram," he said. "Thomas Whitmore drew this himself?" His wife confirmed it. Its Price stopped. Started again. "The most complete account of systematic land fraud I've seen in 20 years of practice." He understood what Voss was doing well enough to document the structure, not just individual instances. He looked up. He should have been a lawyer. "He was a rancher," Ethan said. "He's dead." Price received that without flinching. "I know. I heard about it. At the time it came to me as an accident." He paused. "I've had my doubts since, but doubts aren't admissible. Documentation is." "Yes," Price said. "Documentation is." He sat back. "Harrywell. You know about Harrywell. Ruth Alderman told us he's been getting inquiries from other counties." "He's been getting more than inquiries," Price said. "He came to me 6 weeks ago privately, asking if I knew anything about Voss's operations. He's been building a picture from the edges, partial information from Whitfield, a complaint from Palmer County, some financial anomalies his own clerk noticed in the land registry records." He looked at the pages again. "This is the center of the picture. This is what he's been missing. How fast can you get to him?" "He's here," Price said. "Billings. He's been here for 2 weeks. The Helena business finished early." He looked at Ethan. "I can have a meeting with him today." Ethan sat with that for a moment. Timing was either very good luck or the kind of convergence that happened when a thing had been building for long enough that it was finally ready to break. "Voss doesn't know yet that the documents left the county," Ethan said. "He thinks I'm his problem. He sent men after me on the Billings Road." "Follow you here?" "No. I lost them in the foothills north of Black Hollow." Price was thinking fast. Ethan could see it. "If Harrywell moves, within the next 48 hours issues a federal warrant for Voss's land records, sends a marshal, he can do it, before Voss understands what's coming." He stood up. "Transfer of deed. Eliza Whitmore signed under duress. We can have that nullified within the emergency session. It's exactly the kind of coerced transfer Harrywell has authority to void." "What about the sheriff?" Ethan said. "He's Voss's." "Federal marshal supersedes county sheriff authority entirely," Price said. "Sheriff Calder won't have the legal standing to interfere." He was already moving, pulling his coat from the rack on the wall. "Come with me," he said. "Harrywell needs to hear this from you directly." Ethan stood. His ribs reminded him they were there. "Is there somewhere I can clean up first?" he said. Price looked at him, the bruised cheekbone, the 3-day road, and actually smiled briefly, with one side of his mouth. "Probably better if you don't," he said. "Harrowell is a practical man. You, looking like you've been through something real, is more convincing than anything I could put in front of him in writing." Judge Harrowell was not what Ethan had constructed in his head. He'd expected something formal, a man armored in the dignity of his office. What he found was a heavy-set man in a plain wool suit sitting in the front room of a boarding house on Billingsley East Side, drinking coffee and reading a land survey map that was spread across the entirety of a small table. He had thin white hair and a face that looked like it had made a lot of decisions, most of them difficult, and had kept the record of each one in its lines. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks when a stranger is brought to him by someone he trusts, curious, not alarmed. "This is Ethan Walker," Price said. "He's come from Black Hollow." Harrowell's eyes sharpened. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," he said. Ethan sat. He told the story again, leaner this time, tighter, just the architecture of it. Harrowell listened without speaking, without moving, except once to refill his coffee. When Ethan finished, Harrowell looked at the copies. Price had spread on the table next to the survey map. "The originals," Harrowell said. "Root cellar on the Pelham property," Ethan said. "Pelham Township, 6 miles east of Black Hollow on the main road. Property's owned by Voss now." "You hid evidence on Voss's own property," Harrowell said. "Yes, sir." A pause. "That's either very clever or very stupid." "I've been told those sometimes look the same," Ethan said. Harrowell looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested he was making a comprehensive assessment. Then he looked at Price. "Get Cord," he said. "Tell him I need a federal warrant drafted before sundown. Emergency session, Black Hollow, Blackridge County." He looked back at the survey map, then at the copies. "And send a wire to the marshal's office in Helena. I want 2 deputies on the overnight train." Ethan released a breath that had been in his chest since the foothills. Price left. Harrowell remained at the table, looking at the diagram Thomas Whitmore had drawn, the map of acquisitions and dates and names. "Whitmore," he said. "The man who died." "Yes," Ethan said. "He built this for years," Harrowell said. It wasn't a question, just a man reading work and recognizing what it had cost. 2 years that we know of," Ethan said. "His wife kept it for 2 more. Harrowell looked at the diagram. "And the little girl Molly, you said?" "She copied part of this," Ethan said. "Yesterday morning in the back of a dry goods store." Harrowell's expression did something complicated. He looked down at the pages with their mix of Eliza's writing, and, visible in a few sections, the larger, uneven hand of a child doing careful work. "How old?" 7. Harrowell was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, to nobody in particular, in the voice of a man who had made his decision and was moving forward. "All right." The wire to Helena went out that evening. The warrant was drafted before dark. Ethan slept in a real bed for the first time in 4 days at a boarding house 2 streets from Harrowell's, and he slept without dreaming, which was either the sleep of the exhausted or the sleep of a man who had moved a thing as far as he could move it and had handed it to someone better positioned to carry it the rest of the way. In the morning, a wire came back from Helena. 2 deputies on the overnight train. They'd arrive in Billings by noon. Ethan was at the train station when they arrived. 2 men, younger than he'd expected, but with the compact, deliberate movements of people who'd been doing this work long enough to have shed the unnecessary parts of it. Marshals' badges on their coats. They introduced themselves as Reeves and Dolan and asked Ethan 3 questions each, sharp and specific, and then didn't ask any more because they had what they needed. By mid-afternoon, the party was organized. Harrowell, Price, Reeves, Dolan, and Ethan riding south on the Billings Road toward Black Hollow. It was not a fast ride. Harrowell was not a young man and did not ride young, but it was a steady one. Ethan kept his eyes on the road ahead and thought about what was waiting at the other end of it. He thought about Eliza at the ranch, the wagon still hitched the way he'd told her to keep it. He thought about whether Voss had moved against the ranch while he'd been gone, whether the three guys from the Billings Road had come back and reported, and what Voss had decided to do about the variable named Ethan Walker. He thought about the box in the Pelham cellar and whether it was still there. He thought about Molly in the stand of cottonwoods by the Henderson Bridge, because that was where his mind kept going when he thought about what could have gone wrong in the days he'd been away. They came into Black Hollow at dusk on the second day. The town looked the same from the ridge, but it didn't feel the same. There was a quality to the stillness that was different from ordinary evening, quiet, denser, more deliberate. Ethan had felt it before in towns where something had already happened or was about to, and it made the hair on his forearms rise. He looked for smoke and didn't see any. He looked for lights in wrong places and didn't see any. The main street had almost no one on it, which for dusk was wrong. Something's happened, he said, to no one in particular. Voss, Price said beside him. Or prepared to, Ethan said. Harrowell was looking at the town with the calm expression of a man who had ridden into difficult places before, and had developed the habit of not reacting to the appearance of difficulty until he'd assessed what was actually underneath it. Where's the sheriff's office? He said. North end of Main Street, Ethan said. Red door, and Voss's land office adjacent. Harrowell nodded. We'll go to the sheriff first, he said, formally. Whatever he is, he needs to be present when the warrant is read. Otherwise, he becomes a problem later. They rode down the main street at a walk. In a group, unhurried, and the few people who were on the street stopped and watched them come. Ethan saw the recognition move through those watchers, the marshal's badges catching the last light, the unfamiliar faces of federal officers, the presence of a man in a plain suit who had the bearing of someone with authority. He saw the recognition travel, person to person, doorway to doorway, the way things traveled in small towns where everyone was watching everyone else. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, there were perhaps a dozen people on the street behind them. Ethan tied Consequence to the rail and followed Harrowell and the two deputies inside. Sheriff Calder was a man who had aged into his corruption. Without noticing, the way some men did, he'd started out probably decent enough. And somewhere along the way, the accommodations he'd made had accumulated into a character he no longer examined closely. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he stood up with the reflexive authority of a man in his own domain. And then he registered the badges and the bearing and the suit, and he sat back down. Sheriff Calder, Harrowell said, I'm Judge Franklin Harrowell, Federal Circuit Court. I have a warrant for the examination of land records held in this county, including those pertaining to recent transfers involving a Mr. Gideon Voss and multiple property owners. He put the warrant on the desk. I'll need your cooperation. Calder looked at the warrant without touching it. His face was going through several things in quick succession. This is county business, he said. His voice came out steadier than his face. Federal jurisdiction applies to land fraud across county lines, which is what we have here, Harrowell said, pleasantly. The warrant is valid, Sheriff. Deputy Reeves will remain with you while Deputy Dolan and I proceed to the land office. I'd suggest you read it carefully and consider your options, which are to cooperate or to be named as an accessory in the complaint. Those are currently your two options. Calder looked at Reeves, who was standing by the door with the relaxed attentiveness of a man who'd delivered bad news in small rooms before. Calder picked up the warrant and began to read. Ethan left them to it. He went back outside, and the street had more people on it. Now word moved fast in Black Hollow. It always had, and what it was saying tonight was different from what it usually said. He could see people coming out of buildings, not with the caution of people staying safe, but with the tentative, slightly disbelieving look of people who had been waiting to come out for a long time and weren't sure yet if this was actually the moment. He saw Ruth Alderman on the porch of her dry goods, arms folded, watching the street with an expression that was controlled, but not entirely. Her eyes found Ethan, and she tilted her chin, one sharp acknowledgement, and then went back to watching. He needed to get to the ranch. He was about to turn for consequence when the land office door opened and Gideon Voss stepped out. He hadn't been summoned not yet, but he was a man who kept track of everything in his domain, and a party of federal officers riding into Black Hollow was the kind of thing that reached him within minutes. He'd had time to compose himself, to put on the coat, to arrange his expression into the thing that wasn't quite calm but performed it. He looked at Ethan first. There was a moment between them on that street, the dusk going gray above the buildings, a cold wind off the plains, the sound of people behind Ethan, and the land office door still open behind Voss. A moment that had the quality of everything that had happened in the last 4 days, compressing itself into the space between two men standing 40 feet apart on a Montana main street. Voss looked at him the way he'd been described, with interest. Not anger, interest. The recalibration of a man who had underestimated something and was now adjusting his model. "Walker," he said. "Voss," Ethan said. Voss looked at the street, at Harrowell coming out of the land office behind him with documents under his arm, at Dolan taking up a position by the door, at the people gathering on the boardwalks. He was doing what he always did. Ethan understood. Counting, calculating, finding the angle. "You've been to Billings," Voss said. "Flat, factual, I have." "What's in the saddlebag isn't enough," Voss said. "Copies of documents. No originals a good lawyer could. The originals are on their way," Ethan said. Voss looked at him. Something in the look shifted not fear, not yet, but the first movement toward it, the recognition that the variable he'd been tracking had moved beyond where he'd calculated it could go. "On their way from where?" Voss said. "From wherever Thomas Whitmore put them," Ethan said. "Careful man. Thorough." The name landed. Ethan watched it. Land saw something move in Voss's face that he'd have missed if he hadn't been looking for it. Not guilt men like Voss had moved past guilt a long time ago, but something adjacent to it. The registration of a name that was supposed to be closed. Behind Ethan, he heard boots on the boardwalk. A hand on his arm, not grabbing, just touching, the way you touch an elbow when you're standing next to someone in a crowd, turned. It wasn't Eliza. It was a man he didn't know, older, weathered, with the look of a man who'd been a rancher his whole life and had the body to prove it. Behind him were 2 more men of similar vintage, and behind them, others. "Name's Aldous Pruitt," the man said. "My family had the north parcel before Voss took it. 3 years ago, he looked past Ethan at Voss. We'd been waiting for something like this." Ethan looked at him, then at the people gathering behind him. It wasn't a crowd yet, but it was becoming one families, ranchers, men and women who had been living inside Voss's particular gravity for years, and were now, very carefully, very tentatively, testing whether it had changed. Pruitt looked at Ethan. "What do you need us to do?" Ethan thought about what Eliza had said, sitting at her kitchen table, with her hands flat and her voice flat and no bitterness in it. Everyone in town knows Gideon's name. Nobody dares challenge him. And what he'd thought then, which he hadn't said out loud, because it wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud until you knew whether it was true. Thought, not nobody, just nobody yet. "Tell the judge what happened to you," Ethan said to Pruitt. "Names, dates, what was taken, whatever you remember, however small." He looked at the others gathering behind. "All of you. Tell him." Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Voss. Voss was watching the gathering crowd with the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic and arriving at a number he didn't like. Pruitt turned his back on Voss with the deliberate, unhurried motion of a man who had been afraid to do that for 3 years and was finding it, against all expectation, possible. He walked toward the judge's position at the land office and didn't look back. The others followed one at a time, then in groups. Ethan watched them come, didn't move, and kept himself positioned between the gathering and Voss, not blocking, not threatening, just present, the way you stood when you wanted someone to know that whatever they were thinking about doing, there was a witness. Voss was still on the street, still calculating, but the calculation was taking longer now, and the longer it took, the more people joined the line outside the land office where Harrowell was setting up an informal hearing by lantern light. And the more that line grew, the harder the arithmetic it got. Calder came out of the sheriff's office with Reeves behind him, having apparently read the warrant and arrived at his only survivable option, which was a reluctant cooperation he was performing with the grace of a man being fitted for a coat he hated. Ruth Alderman came off her porch and joined the line. The woman from the well, one of the two who'd stopped talking when Ethan rode through that Herb Morning came out of a doorway and joined it. Ethan watched Voss's face through all of this. He watched the interest in it become something else, something harder to read, not defeat, not yet, because Voss wasn't built for defeat. He was built for adaptation. But something was moving behind those eyes. The recalculation of a man who had built everything on the assumption that silence was permanent, that fear was a renewable resource, that the people of Black Hollow would go on choosing the path of least resistance indefinitely. He'd been right for 11 years. 11 years was a long time to be right, long enough to forget that it wasn't a law, just a pattern, and patterns broke. Ethan turned away from Voss and walked toward the line. He had a ranch to check on, and a woman who had told him to come back, and a child waiting in cottonwoods by a bridge. And Harrowell and Price and 2 federal deputies were here now, and the thing had been set in motion, and what happened next on this street was no longer primarily his to carry. He got to Consequence and untied her, and was mounting when he heard Voss's voice behind him, carrying across the street with the practiced projection of a man used to being heard. "You came here for a cow, Walker." Ethan settled into the saddle. He looked back. Voss was standing in the middle of the street, alone now, the gathering having moved past and around him, the way water moved around, a stone not avoiding him exactly, just no longer organizing itself around his gravity. He looked, for the first time, like what he was, a man standing by himself in the middle of a street in a town that was no longer his. "I did," Ethan said. "Was it worth it?" Voss said. "All of this. For a woman who isn't your family. For a county that isn't your county." Ethan looked at him for a moment. He thought about the right answer to that, and then he thought about whether it required an answer at all, and he decided it didn't, that some questions got answered by what you'd already done, and anything he said out loud would be less true than that. Turned Consequence east and rode. The road out of Black Hollow was dark now, the last of the dusk gone, and the stars were coming out in the cold Montana sky with the indifferent brilliance they always had, as if whatever happened below them was simply not their concern. Consequence moved at a lope, sure-footed in the dark on a road she'd traveled before, and Ethan let her go and kept his eyes on the eastern darkness where a ranch sat 6 miles away, with its lamp burning or not burning, and its wagon hitched or not. Find out when he got there. He rode. The lamp was burning. He saw it from half a mile out, a single orange point in the eastern dark, steady, not moving, which meant it was in the window and not being carried, which meant someone was in the house, which meant probably that things were not as bad as the several versions of bad he'd been constructing in his head for the last 6 miles. He slowed Consequence from a lope to a trot, and then to a walk as he came up the last stretch of road, not because he thought there was danger, but because riding hard into a dark yard was the kind of thing that startled people who were already on edge. And Eliza Whitmore had been on edge since before he met her, and had earned the right to not be startled in her own yard. The wagon was still hitched. He noticed that first the wagon sitting in the yard with the horse still in the traces, which meant she'd followed his instructions, which meant she'd been ready to run and hadn't had to, which meant the day had been survivable. He dismounted at the fence and walked Consequence to the post and tied her and stood in the yard for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. The barn was quiet. The night around it was the deep quiet of open country, the kind that wasn't empty, but was simply itself wind and dry grass, a horse shifting, the particular sound of cold air moving through pine boards. He knocked. He did it because he'd thought about Voss not knocking, the way that had been described to him, a man who walked into spaces because he considered them his. Ethan knocked, and he waited, and he heard footsteps inside, and then the door opened. Eliza stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand and the other hand not visible, which meant it was behind the doorframe, which meant she was holding something she'd decided he didn't need to see unless he turned out to be someone she needed to show it to. When she registered his face, the bruised cheekbone, the road, the fact that he was upright, her hand came from behind the doorframe empty, and the lamp lowered slightly. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be." She looked at him for a moment with the lamp between them, throwing light up at both their faces in the way lamplight did, making everything look a little more serious than daylight would. "Harrowell," she said, "in Black Hollow right now, with 2 federal deputies and Arthur Price." Something moved through her expression, not the relief he might have expected, or not only that, something more complicated, the expression of a person who has been hoping for a specific thing for so long that when it arrives it doesn't feel like relief so much as a strange, disorienting weight being lifted, and the muscles that had been holding against it for so long don't quite know what to do with the absence. "Come in," she said. Molly was at the kitchen table, not asleep despite the hour, with a book open in front of her that she clearly hadn't been reading. She looked up when Ethan came through the door, and her face did the opposite of composing itself. It just opened, the way children's faces opened before they'd learned to control them, all of the last several days visible in it at once. "You look terrible," she said. "Everyone keeps saying that," he said. "Keeps being true," she said. He sat down at the table. Eliza put coffee on without asking, and then sat across from him, and he told them both what had happened. Billings, Price's office, Harrowell at the boarding house table with Thomas's documents spread in front of him, the wire to Helena, train at noon, the ride south, and then the street in Black Hollow at dusk, with the line forming outside the land office, and Pruitt turning his back on Voss, with the deliberate motion of a man reclaiming something he'd given up 3 years ago. Told it plain, without decoration, the way it had actually happened, including the parts where he hadn't known if it was going to work, and the part where he'd slept in a draw in the cold, and the part where his ribs had made every mile of the return trip an ongoing negotiation. Molly listened with her chin in her hands, and her eyes on him, not interrupting, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt," Eliza said. "He came forward. Him and others. Maybe a dozen by the time I rode out." Harrowell was taking statements. Eliza looked at the table. She'd known Pruitt knew what it meant for him to turn his back on Voss in the middle of the main street of Black Hollow, knowing Voss was standing right there watching. She understood the cost of that in a way Ethan could approximate but not fully reach, because he hadn't lived inside this county's particular fear for years. Thomas always, he said, Pruitt was the one who'd move first if anyone moved, she said. He said Pruitt had the most anger and the most to lose, and that combination makes people either very still or very loud, and he wasn't sure which Pruitt was. He was loud, Ethan said. She almost smiled again, the same almost as on the porch of the dry goods store close but not arriving. Thomas would have liked that, she said. Molly reached across and put the book away from in front of her, closing it and setting it at the table's edge with the careful motion of someone formally ending one thing before starting another. "What happens to Voss now?" she said. "The warrant covers his land records, going back to when he started buying properties," Ethan said. "The documents from the seller hold up and they will. Your father was thorough. Harrowell can void the fraudulent transfers. The deed your mother signed yesterday is already being challenged. Price is handling that personally, and Voss himself," Molly said. "What happens to him?" Ethan looked at her. She was 7 and asking a precise legal and moral question and expected a precise answer. And he found he didn't want to be vague with her because she'd been handling unvague things for most of her short life, and she deserved the same. "He'll face federal charges," Ethan said. "Land fraud across county lines, which is federal. Possibly charges related to your father's death, if the investigation turns up what I think it will. Harrowell has authority to hold him pending trial. He paused. He won't be coming back here, Molly. Not the way he was. Molly absorbed this. She looked at the table. Then she looked at her mother. Something passed between them, that compressed language they'd developed, the one that carried whole conversations in a single glance, and this one seemed to resolve something that had been sitting open between them. For a long time, some question that neither of them had been able to ask or answer, while the weight of everything else was on top of it. Eliza reached out and put her hand over Molly's on the table. Just that. Didn't say anything. Molly turned her hand over and held her mother's and looked at Ethan. "Will you stay?" she said. The question landed in the kitchen, the same way it had landed in the yard of the ranch. 3 days ago, when it had been the first time she'd asked it, and he'd answered with the cow, and the cow had been a kind of deflection that they'd all understood was a deflection. She was asking it again, now without deflection available, with the full weight of the question behind it, and the full weight was considerable. Ethan looked at his coffee. He looked at his hands around it, the knuckles, still scraped from the feed store, the calluses that came from rope and leather, and 36 years of working with them. He looked at the kitchen that was clean and small, and had the embroidered curtains and the spot on the wall where something had been taken down. He thought about Silver Creek, about the house with the roof he'd been meaning to patch, and the pasture that needed better fencing, and the particular quality of alone that he'd been living inside for long enough that he'd started to think of it as a personality trait rather than a circumstance. He thought about what he'd said to Eliza on the porch of the dry goods store. 17 years of surviving, getting tired of being good at it. "Don't know," he said. "Honestly, I don't know what staying looks like." Eliza was looking at him. Not pressuring, she wasn't built for pressuring. She was built for waiting and watching and making accurate assessments. She was doing that now. "It doesn't have to look like anything yet," she said. "It can just be not leaving." He looked at her. "The roof needs work," she said. Not as a come-on, as a fact, the way she stated facts. "The north fence line is down in 2 places. The barn needs chinking before winter." "That's a lot of work," he said. "It is," she said. "I've been doing it alone." It was said without self-pity, which was the only way she said anything. Just a plain statement of a situation. "I came here to buy a cow," he said. "She's in the barn," Eliza said. "She's been there all week. You haven't bought her yet." Molly's face across the table was doing the thing children's faces did when they were trying very hard not to look like they cared about something as much as they did. She was watching the space between the two adults with the focused attention of someone waiting to see which way a weather vane turned. "I'd have to go back to Silver Creek," Ethan said. "Settle some things. My own place." "I'm not asking you to not have a life," Eliza said. "I'm asking you to not disappear." A pause. "There's a difference." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She looked back, straight on, the way she'd looked at him from the beginning, not asking him to be more than he was, not performing anything, just seeing him with the clear, practical eyes of a woman who had learned that accurate assent was survival. "All right," he said. Molly exhaled a slow breath that she'd clearly been holding, and then looked down at the table quickly, as if she hadn't done that. "All right," Ethan said again, quieter, to himself mostly, "the way you said something, when you were acknowledging a decision's weight rather than announcing it." He slept in the barn again that night. Not because he was asked to, not because there wasn't space in the house, there was a spare room. He'd seen the door, but because the barn was what he was familiar with, and familiar was what he needed after a week like this one. Consequence was there, and the milk cow in the next stall, and the cold and the hay and the sounds of the night were simple in a way that nothing else had been simple for 6 days. He lay in the loft and looked at the boards above him, and thought about Thomas Whitmore, who had lain in this same barn probably, or stood in it, or worked in it, and had known something was coming, and had built the best defense he could against it, and hadn't lived to see it matter. There was something important in that, Ethan thought. not a lesson with clean edges. Those were for people who hadn't been paying attention, but something more honest than that. Thomas had built the case not knowing if he'd survive to use it. He'd done the work anyway, tucked it under the floorboard and kept going and taught his daughter to write properly. And loved his wife and got on his horse one morning to check the east fence. You did the work without knowing if you'd be the one who got to see it through. That was the whole of it. The rest was just what happened. He fell asleep with that thought and didn't dream. 3 weeks later, Harrowell's formal hearing concluded in Black Hollow, in the very room where Sheriff Calder had been taking Voss's guidance for the better part of a decade. Calder himself sat in that room, not behind the desk, but across from it, in the chair that had previously been reserved for people. Calder had agreed to intimidate on Voss's behalf. He did not look comfortable, which was appropriate. Gideon Voss did not attend the hearing, because Gideon Voss was in federal custody in Billings' pending trial on 7 counts of land fraud across 3 counties, 2 counts of criminal coercion, and 1 count, the one that had taken the longest and the most careful assembly of testimony of conspiracy in the death of Thomas Whitmore. The conspiracy charge was not certain. Price had explained this to Eliza with the careful honesty of a lawyer who respected his client. Not certain. He'd said, but substantive. The evidence was circumstantial in parts, but the pattern was clear, and Harrowell had seen the pattern. Eliza had listened to this and nodded and thanked Price, and then sat on the porch for a long time by herself while Molly was inside and Ethan was working the north fence line, and whatever she did with that time, she did it alone, which was her right. The land transfers Voss had executed through coercion were voided in succession, each one requiring a separate hearing, each hearing bringing forward the family that had been displaced or pressured, the Pruitts, the Garcias, who had moved away but sent written testimony with a notarized signature, 4 other families who had taken Voss's money under duress and signed because the alternative was worse. Each voiding was a separate proceeding, and each one took time, and the time added up. But the Whitmore deed was first. Harrowell voided it personally, in writing, with a formality that Eliza had not expected. She'd expected something administrative, a piece of paper with stamps on it. What she got was a 5-minute statement from Harrowell in the makeshift courtroom in which he laid out the specific legal basis, the specific evidence, and the specific finding that the transfer had been obtained through criminal coercion and was therefore void from the moment of signing. He used the word criminal, out loud in a room with 30 people in it, looking at the document with its ink and her signature on it. Eliza sat straight through all of it and said nothing, and thanked the judge afterward with 2 words, and walked out of the building into the November air. And Ethan was waiting outside with Molly, because he'd known, without being told, that she'd want to come out of that room to familiar faces, and not to a crowd. Molly took her mother's hand the moment she came through the door. Eliza held it, and they stood there on the boardwalk in the cold, the 3 of them, while the sound of the hearing continued inside. "Done?" Molly said. "The deed is yes," Ethan said. Molly looked at her mother's face and did the calculation children did when they were trying to figure out what an adult's expression meant. "Are you okay, Mama?" Eliza looked down at her daughter. There was something stamped in her face that had been moving all morning toward this moment, some slow thaw that had started. When Harrowell said the word criminal in a room full of witnesses, and now it arrived not dramatically, not in any way that looked like what you might expect from the outside. Her eyes didn't fill, her face didn't crumple. She just looked at Molly with an expression that was so exhausted and so full at the same time that it almost looked like nothing if you didn't know how to read it. "Getting there," she said. Hicks the freight man had made it to Whitfield County. Packet had reached Sheriff Cray 10 days earlier, and Cray had sent his own communication to Harrowell, a formal letter that Harrowell had received and added to the case, another piece of Thomas Whitmore's careful work, arriving from an unexpected direction to do what it had been built to do. Cray had written in his letter that he'd been waiting 2 years for something concrete, and when Harrowell wrote back, he did so with the efficiency of a man who had all the pieces finally on the table. The Whitfield and Palmer County complaints were folded into the federal case against Voss, which widened the scope of the fraud charges and made the trial when it came considerably less survivable for Voss than it would have been on Blackridge County evidence alone. Ruth Alderman told Ethan about the Whitfield letter over coffee in the back of the dry goods in the same storeroom where they'd made the copies. She told him the way she told most things straight, without ceremony, and then she looked at him over her cup and said, "You know what made the difference." "The documents," he said. "Before the documents," she said, "the day at the feed store. Cale Duggan and his men, and a woman whose wrist was being held, and a stranger who had no reason to do anything about it." She looked at her coffee. "This county has been waiting for something to crack for 3 years. What it needed wasn't a hero. It needed a place to start." Ethan considered this. "I hit a man into a wall." "You stood in the middle of the road," Ruth said, "in front of people who were watching from windows and doorways, and who had been watching men like Duggan do whatever they wanted for years. You stood there, and it looked possible. Thing a person could do." She set her cup down. "That's rarer than you'd think." He didn't say anything. "Thomas did everything right," Ruth said. "Built the case, made the connections, understood the structure of what Voss was doing. And he couldn't crack it alone, because it wasn't the kind of thing one person cracked alone. It needed someone to stand in the road first, so the people watching from the windows could see that standing was possible." She looked at Ethan. "I'm not saying you're the hero of this story." "Good," he said. "I'm saying you were the hinge," she said. The thing the door turned on. He went back to Silver Creek in early December, as he'd said he would. He had a house with a roof that needed work, and a pasture, and animals that had been looked after by a neighbor boy. For 2 weeks, in exchange for work he'd pay back in the spring. He had a life there, such as it was, and he owed it in accounting. He rode back in cold weather, the first real winter cold, settling into the ground and stiffening the grass, and making Consequence's breath come in visible clouds. He left in the morning early, because leaving in the morning was cleaner than leaving in the afternoon. When the day's weight had accumulated, Eliza walked with him to the gate. She was wearing her winter coat, the heavy brown one, and her hair was down in a way he'd not seen before, usually pulled back and pinned, now loose against her collar in the cold. It made her look different. Not younger, exactly, just less armored, which he understood was not something she did easily. "Silver Creek is how far?" she said. "Day's ride when the weather's good," he said. "Bit more in winter." "That's not far," she said matter-of-factly. "No," he said. "It's not far." They stood at the gate in the cold, and she looked at him with those October eyes, direct and clear, and not asking him for anything, not performing anything, just looking at him, the way she'd looked at him from the beginning, as he actually was, which was a man who was better at some things than others, and knew which was which, and didn't pretend otherwise. "The north fence," he said. "I'll manage the north fence," she said. "I know you will," he said, "but I'll be back before it gets worse." She looked at the gatepost, then at the road. "The cow," she said. "You still haven't bought her. I'll pay you when I get back. What if she's not for sale anymore?" "Is she?" Eliza looked at him. A long beat. "She might not be," she said. He almost smiled. Got there, which was something. "Then I'll find another reason to come back." "You don't need a reason," she said, quietly, plainly, the way she said everything important without decoration, without insurance, just the thing itself. He got on Consequence and turned her west and didn't look back, because he'd learned by now that not looking back was sometimes the more honest thing. Looking back could be hope or it could be doubt, and he didn't want to perform either. He knew where he was going. He knew where he was coming back to. That was enough. Molly had come to the fence while he wasn't watching. She had a talent for appearing without announcement, for being present before you registered her arrival. She was standing at the post with her arms folded against the cold, her hair also loose, and her boots correctly on the correct feet, which he'd started to think of as her signal that she was fully present and paying attention. Paused Consequence. "You'll come back before the fence gets worse," she said. Your mother already said that. I'm saying it too, she said. So now 2 people have said it. He looked at her. I'll come back before the fence gets worse, he said. She nodded once, formal, like a contract witness. Okay, she said. He wrote, it was the kind of morning that Montana produced in early winter that was purely itself cold and wide and clear, the kind of clarity that came when the air had been scrubbed clean by cold and held nothing between you and the distance. He could see the mountains to the northwest and the plains rolling away south and the road ahead going west through the grass that was the color of old straw. He thought about what Ruth had said. The hinge, the thing the door turned on. He didn't think of himself that way, had never thought of himself as anything that important to any story except his own. But he understood what she was pointing at, even if the word wasn't quite right. There was a thing that happened sometimes in a situation that had been locked for a long time, where the lock wasn't as strong as everyone believed, but nobody had tested it. And then someone tested it not because they were brave or built for it, but because they were standing there and couldn't quite make themselves look away, and the lock, which had seemed iron, turned out to be something more like fear of iron. And once the door was open, people who'd been waiting on the other side, their whole lives came through. He hadn't set out to open anything. He'd set out to buy a milk cow, but that was how it usually went in his experience. The things that changed you weren't the things you prepared for. They were the things you walked into without seeing clearly, because you were still thinking about the cow. He thought about Thomas Whitmore, who had worked for 2 years on a case he didn't live to use. He thought about a 7-year-old girl copying land records in a storeroom with her tongue between her teeth, making herself useful because it was the thing available to her. He thought about Eliza at the kitchen table, with her hands flat, saying every door is locked from his side in the voice of a woman who had looked at every door and had not given up, which was a different thing from not being afraid. The world was full of people holding something in the dark, waiting for the moment it could matter. Thomas Whitmore had died holding it, but he'd kept it safe. Eliza had carried it for 2 years alone. And when the moment came, the thing held the careful work, the patient preservation, trust that it would eventually find its use. You didn't always get to see what you'd built matter. That was the hardest part. The thing you built, case you made, the record you kept it might lie under a barn floor. For 2 years after you were gone, waiting for the right set of circumstances, the right stranger on the Billings Road, the right judge who'd been asking the right questions. You couldn't control any of that. You could only control whether the thing you built was worth finding. Thomas Whitmore had built something worth finding. That was not a small thing. Constance found her pace on the open road and settled into it, the easy ground-eating lope she preferred when the terrain was good and the day was long, and Ethan let her go and watched the mountains and thought about roof patches and fence lines, and the particular smell of a kitchen where someone had been cooking the same food in the same cast-iron pan for years. He thought about Molly's voice. 2 people have said it now. Thought about Eliza. You don't need a reason. The road west was long and cold and clear, and he rode it without hurry, which was new. He'd been riding with hurry for most of his adult life. Hurry to the next job, the next county, the next version of surviving. The hurry had been so constant that he'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound that was always present. He noticed its absence now. It felt like something was behind him, not chasing, but there a lamp in a window, orange and steady, not going anywhere, just present. The kind of light you could navigate by if you kept it in mind. He reached Silver Creek in the late afternoon of the following day. The house visible from the road, with its unpatched roof and its small yard and the pasture where the animals were waiting. The neighbor boy had done a decent job. The water wasn't frozen. The firewood was stacked wrong, but present. Put consequence in the barn, and fed her, and stood in his own house for the first time in over a week, and looked at it with the eyes of a man who was seeing it slightly differently than he'd left it, not worse, not better, just different. Smaller, maybe. Not in a bad way, just in the way things looked when you'd been somewhere else and come back. A section of roof the next morning. He spent the following day on fencing. He wrote a letter to Price, brief, asking for updates on the Voss proceedings, and left it with the postwriter, who came through on Thursdays. A week in, a letter came from Black Hollow. It was brief, 1 page in Eliza's clean, quick handwriting. The Pelham cellar had been accessed by Harrowell's deputies, the originals confirmed intact, entered into federal record. Sheriff Calder had resigned, not charged, not yet, but gone, which for Black Hollow amounted to the same immediate relief. A man named Holt had been appointed interim sheriff from Whitfield, clean record, Cray's recommendation. The land office was under federal administration, pending the trial. Pruitt and 2 other families had begun the process of reclaiming their properties. The milk cow had eaten through most of the stored hay, and Molly had named her Biscuit, which Eliza wrote with the dry neutrality of a woman who had opinions about this development and had accepted it anyway. The north fence was holding. He read the letter twice. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat, where it stayed for the rest of the week, with the particular weight of something you wanted to keep close because you were not done with it. He left for Black Hollow on a Thursday, 2 weeks after he'd arrived home. He told himself it was because of the fence. He told himself it was because of the cow he still hadn't formally purchased. He told himself several things on the road east, and all of them were true, and none of them were the whole truth, and the whole truth was simpler and more uncomfortable than any of them. The whole truth was that the house at Silver Creek felt like a place he was staying, and the Whitmore Ranch felt like something else, something without a clean word, particular quality of a place where people expected you back and had a chair at the table that was used when you were there and empty when you weren't. And the distinction between those 2 states mattered to the people doing the waiting. He'd been a man without a chair at a table for 17 years. He was finding that he wanted to be a man with one. He came over the rise, and the Whitmore Ranch came into view below the house. The barn leaning slightly south, the chicken coop, the 3 fence lines. The north fence, from this distance, looked like it had held. The yard had the organized look of a place where work had been done that morning. Tools put away, the wagon parked with some care rather than just stopped where it stopped. The lamp wasn't lit, yet it was still afternoon, but the house had the quality of being inhabited, of having people in it who were in the middle of their day and not expecting company. He was going to need to knock. He was fine with that. Consequence carried him down the slope at a walk, and the cold air came off the mountains, and the grass was winter pale, and the sky above it all was the enormous Montana sky, the kind that made everything below it look both small and exactly the right size at the same time. He thought about a man coming to a town looking for a cow. He thought about all the things that had come from that, the feed store, the metal box, the root cellar, and the road to Billings, a judge with a warrant, a line of people outside a land office at dusk, each one turning their back on the thing they'd been afraid of and walking toward something else instead. He thought about Molly copying documents in a storeroom with her tongue between her teeth. He thought about Eliza saying, "You don't need a reason." Here was what he'd learned, riding this road, and the ones before it. For 36 years, you didn't find the things that mattered by looking for them. You found them by turning a corner you hadn't planned to turn, by stopping when you could have kept riding, by standing in the road when every practical argument said move on. Cow was real. The cow was still in the barn, and he still needed her, and that was a real thing. But some things you went looking for, and some things you walked into. And the things you walked into, in his experience, were almost always the things that turned out to matter. He reached the gate, dismounted, and tied Consequence to the post, and walked across the yard, and knocked on the door. He waited. The sound of footsteps inside quick ones, light, which meant Molly, which meant she'd been near the door, which meant she'd heard Consequence on the road and had been waiting in the way she always waited, with her whole self positioned toward whatever was coming, and her face ready to be exactly as glad as it was, without hiding any of it. The door opened. Molly looked up at him. Her hair was in a braid today. Her boots were on correctly. She looked at his face. The bruise was mostly faded now, yellow at the edges, and then at consequence at the post, and then back at him. You came back, she said. I said I would, he said. People say things, she said, with the flat wisdom of a child who had learned that lesson younger than she should have. Yes, he said. They do. He looked at her. I'm not most people. She considered this with the serious attention she gave to most things. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open. Mama's in the kitchen, she said. He stepped inside. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something on the stove that had been cooking since morning, the smell of a house that was in the middle of a day, not waiting for one. The embroidered curtains on the windows were bright in the afternoon light. The chair with the smaller seat was pushed back from the table at its particular angle. Eliza was at the stove. She heard him come in and turned not startled, because she'd heard consequence too, the way a person heard sounds they'd been listening for, and she looked at him with those clear October eyes, and something in her face settled. The smallest visible shift, like a door coming fully closed after sitting open a crack. She turned back to the stove. Coffee's made, she said. He took off his hat. He sat down at the table, the chair across from the small one, the chair that had been there when Thomas was there, and empty since, and was now, tentatively, becoming something else. Molly sat in her chair and put her chin in her hands and looked at him. Biscuit needs more hay, she said. I told Mama we should get more, but she says there's enough until spring. There's enough until spring, Eliza said from the stove. She's a big cow, Molly said to Ethan, with the expression of someone appealing a decision to a higher authority. I'll look at the supply, Ethan said. Eliza set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and looked at him with the practical, direct gaze of a woman who had things to say and would say them in order when she was ready. The fence on the north line, she said. Second post from the creek is loose. I drove it in twice, but the ground is too soft. I'll look at that too, he said. And the barn needs. Eliza, he said. She stopped. He looked at her across the table, across the coffee, the lamp, the kitchen that smelled like a place that was lived in, and she looked back. I'm here, he said. Just that. She looked at him for a long moment, and something happened in her expression that he'd only seen briefly before, once or twice, and only in glimpses, something that wasn't armored, that wasn't calculating or careful or controlled, something that was simply, plainly, tired of carrying alone and glad not to be, which was not the same as weakness, which was not the same as need, which was the most honest thing a person who had been holding everything by themselves for years could let show. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar directness. The second post from the creek, she said. After coffee, he said. Picked up her cup. After coffee, she agreed. Outside, the afternoon was going toward evening. The sky beginning to go that particular color it went in Montana, in November not quite purple, not quite gray, the color of cold air settling in for the long night. The lamp would need lighting soon. The cow would need checking. The fence post would need attention tomorrow, or the day after, when the ground could be worked. There was a great deal of work. There always was, on a frontier ranch in winter, and there always would be. And that was simply the nature of it, not a complaint, not a tragedy, just the ongoing reality of a life lived close to the ground, where the work was never finished, and the point was not to finish it, but to keep doing it, one season into the next, with people beside you worth doing it. Ethan drank his coffee. Molly told him about Biscuit in considerable detail. The lamp burned steady in the window, orange against the darkening, and outside the cold came down from the mountains, the way it always did, indifferent and enormous. And inside the kitchen was warm.